Chris Wilding was a shy boy in the early 1960s, enrolled in school somewhere in Europe, while his mother made the most expensive film in Hollywood history. He didn't follow the trade papers. He didn't know what the Vatican's newspaper had written about Elizabeth Taylor's erotic vagrancy. He just knew that when he walked into class, the other kids had things to say. Decades later, in the BBC documentary Elizabeth Taylor, Rebel Superstar, Christopher recalled the unpleasant taunts from classmates about his mother's sex life. He used to get embarrassed when she turned up at school. He was 8 or 9. His mother was falling in love with Richard Burton on the set of Cleopatra while still married to Eddie Fisher. Photographers tracked her from set to hotel to restaurant. Headlines screened, and a quiet child sat in a classroom absorbing mockery sourced from tabloids he'd never read, about things he couldn't yet understand. The world consumed Elizabeth Taylor as spectacle. Her children experienced her as mom. That distinction between what the cameras captured and what 4 kids actually lived is the story that almost never gets told. Taylor had 4 children, born across 3 marriages in less than 9 years. Michael Howard Wilding Jr. arrived on January 6, 1953, her first child with second husband, British actor Michael Wilding. Christopher Edward Wilding followed on February 27, 1955, Taylor's own 23rd birthday. Elizabeth Liza Frances Todd was born August 6, 1957, daughter of film producer Mike Todd, Taylor's 3rd husband. And Maria McKeown, born in 1961, was a German orphan Taylor began adopting while married to 4th husband Eddie Fisher. When Taylor married Richard Burton in 1964, Burton adopted both Liza and Maria. 4 children, 3 fathers, 5 marriages completed before the youngest turned 3. That was just the opening act. ABC News, writing after Taylor's death in 2011, noted the obvious. In all the coverage of Taylor's life, her children seemed like little more than a footnote. Biographer William J. Mann added context. She was this globe-trotting, beautiful siren who kept them out of the spotlight. She wasn't pushing them onto TV shows as some famous parents do. There wasn't a lot of use of her children in the media. Taylor kept the children out deliberately. Christopher confirmed it years later in a remark that Mann cited. "My mother protected us from the circus." Protection only goes so far, though, when the circus moves into the house. The first catastrophe arrived on March 22, 1958, when Mike Todd's private plane crashed in a thunderstorm over New Mexico. No survivors. Taylor was 26 years old. Michael was 5. Christopher had just turned 3. Liza was 7 months old. By her 27th birthday, Taylor had been twice divorced and once widowed. Biographer Kate Anderson Brower, who was granted unprecedented access to Taylor's private diaries and letters for the authorized biography, Elizabeth Taylor, The Grit and Glamour of an Icon, confirmed the toll on the family structure during a PBS interview. By the time she was 26, she had been twice divorced and once widowed. In a memoir excerpt shared by the Elizabeth Taylor archives, Taylor wrote something revealing about those early years. "Up until Richard, I was always afraid that my children somehow suffered from not having a father. But they had fallen in love with Richard, and he with them." The sentence covers roughly 12 years, 1952 to 1964, during which she had 3 husbands. None of them, in her estimation, had functioned as a father. Michael Wilding was 20 years her senior, gentle but passive, and the marriage was already failing by the time Christopher was born. Mike Todd was dead 13 months after the wedding. Eddie Fisher was, by all accounts, a man too consumed with his own career and heartbreak to parent someone else's children. The period between Todd's death in March 1958 and her marriage to Fisher in 1959 was the clearest stretch in which Taylor was legally, practically, alone with young children and no spouse in the home. She had 3 kids under 6 and was grieving a husband she would later describe as the love of her life. "God, I loved him," she said. "My self-esteem, my image, everything soared under his exuberant, loving care." Then the exuberant, loving care vanished in a thunderstorm, and 3 children needed to be fed, clothed, bathed, and held by whoever was left. Before the Burton scandal made Taylor the most condemned woman in the Western press, she nearly died. In 1961, while filming Cleopatra in London, she contracted pneumonia so severe her lungs collapsed. Doctors performed an emergency tracheotomy to save her life. She spent weeks in a hospital bed, breathing through a hole in her throat. 6 weeks later, she attended the 33rd Academy Awards at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, with the scar faintly visible on her neck, accepted the Best Actress Oscar for Butterfield 8, and fainted in a backstage restroom. She later acknowledged the Academy probably gave it to her out of sympathy more than admiration. Michael was 8, Christopher was 6, Liza was 4. Maria hadn't yet joined the family. Their mother had been on a different continent, intubated and dying, and then she came back and went to an awards show. According to one chronicler cited in the Los Angeles Times obituary, Taylor would ultimately suffer more than 70 illnesses, injuries, and accidents, requiring hospitalization over the course of her life. An appendectomy, a punctured esophagus, a hysterectomy, dysentery, an ulcerated eye, smashed spinal discs, phlebitis, skin cancer, hip replacements, and in 1997, the removal of a benign brain tumor. By her own count, she nearly died 4 times. For the children, illness wasn't a crisis. It was a constant, something like weather, always present, periodically dangerous, impossible to plan around. The Cleopatra shoot birthed more than a near-death experience. Taylor's affair with Richard Burton during production became one of the most widely covered celebrity scandals of the century. She was still married to Fisher. Burton was still married to Sybil Williams. It didn't matter. They collided on set, fell into each other, and refused to hide it. Christopher, at school, absorbed the fallout. The People report on his remarks in the BBC documentary specifies that he recalled taunts from classmates about his mother's sex life. Not vague teasing, but specific cruelty rooted in headlines. The Guardian described him as a shy man who, as a boy, used to get embarrassed when his mother turned up at school. He didn't have the vocabulary to process what was happening. He just knew that his mother's face on a magazine cover meant a worse day at school. Taylor divorced Fisher and married Burton on March 15, 1964, the same day the divorce was finalized. Burton adopted both Liza and Maria, giving the family its closest thing to structural stability in years. Taylor's memoir described it as a turning point. The children finally had a father they could love, and who loved them back. Roger Ebert, visiting Taylor and Burton for a published interview, captured a domestic scene. Burton stroking the hair back from the face of Liza Todd as the family sat together. It was a small gesture. For a child who'd lost her biological father at 7 months old, small gestures were the whole architecture of security. The Burton years gave the family its highest highs and its most spectacular collapses. Taylor and Burton earned enormous sums. They were the highest-paid couple in Hollywood, and spent lavishly across homes in Switzerland, Mexico, and wherever filming took them. The children traveled with them, attended schools across continents, and witnessed the kind of volatility that came from 2 people who loved each other intensely and drank even more intensely. Burton documented it in his diaries. In a 1969 entry, he wrote about the deterioration. "We have been fighting and have been fighting for over a year now. over anything and everything. I dread it at night when she has had her shots of drugs and is only semi-articulate. When she moans and groans in agony, I simply become bored. They divorced in 1974, remarried in 1975, divorced again in July 1976. Michael was 23 by then. Christopher was 21. Liza was 19. Maria was about 15. The older children had spent their adolescence inside the Burton circus. Maria, the youngest, had known no other kind of family life. After Burton, Taylor married John Warner, the Virginia senator, on December 4, 1976. She was 44. She'd been a movie star since age 12, the biggest name in Hollywood for 2 decades, and now she was expected to attend fundraising dinners and campaign events in Washington, D.C. Her film career had effectively stalled. The woman who'd been the first actress ever paid $1 million for a single role, for Cleopatra in a deal she assumed the studio would reject, was now smiling politely at political functions. She hated it, and the hatred turned inward. Taylor said later that life as a senator's wife made her a drunk and a junkie. Brower's biography confirmed that her drinking and drug use worsened dramatically during the Warner years. She gained significant weight. She was bored and lonely. She stopped getting film offers worth taking. The depression deepened. The prescriptions multiplied. Taylor was candid about the progression when she eventually spoke publicly. Drugs have become a crutch. I wouldn't take them just when I was in pain. I needed oblivion, escape. I was hooked on Percodan and, of course, I could drink everybody under the table. I had a hollow leg. My capacity to consume was terrifying. I didn't even realize I was an alcoholic. Her children were adults by now. Michael was approaching 30. Christopher was married to oil heiress Eileen Getty. They weren't small kids sitting in the next room during a bad night. They were grown people, watching their mother's decline from a distance close enough to see it clearly, but too far to physically intervene in her daily choices. Christopher described her relationship with medication in terms that were understanding without being naive. She had physical ailments, especially bad back problems, for which the use of pain meds was a legitimate recourse. When she was little, we had all these miracle drugs, and you took a pill. That was her approach. Better living through science. The problem was that the legitimate use and the addictive use had merged over decades, bound together by chronic pain and a body that kept breaking down. Nobody, not the doctors, not the family, not Taylor herself, could locate the exact point where treatment ended and dependency began. Then Christopher described the moment when abstract concern became something he couldn't forget. During one visit to his mother, Taylor called him to her bedroom. When he arrived, she was holding a syringe of Demerol, a powerful opioid used for severe pain. She asked him to inject her. He said no. It wasn't until I saw her that I realized she was already pretty fucked up on something, Christopher recalled in Brower's book. She looked at me with deadened yet disappointed eyes, took a breath, steadied her hand, and plunged the needle into her flesh. That scene holds the entire contradiction of Elizabeth Taylor's motherhood. She trusted her son enough to ask for help. She was too deep in her addiction to understand what the request meant. He loved her enough to refuse. And then, he had to stand in the doorway and watch her do it herself. Brower's research into Taylor's medical records revealed the institutional scale of the problem. Between 1983 and 1988, 3 physicians wrote a combined 1,000 prescriptions for 28 different drugs, including tranquilizers, sleeping pills, and painkillers. Roughly 1 prescription every 2 days for 5 years straight, from 3 separate doctors. She manipulated her doctors into giving her the pills she wanted, when she wanted them, Brower wrote. It was very hard to say no to Elizabeth Taylor. Moving back to Los Angeles after her separation from Warner didn't change the trajectory. Brower noted that Taylor surrounded herself with assistants and housekeepers who became like family to her and were less likely to call her out on her growing problem. So the actual family did it instead. In the early 1980s, Taylor's children and close relatives organized an intervention. Family members flew in from across the country. They sat down together to confront a woman who had, for decades, controlled every room she entered. Christopher recalled it in the documentary. We'd talk to her, but things got to the point where it was decided an intervention would be necessary. We just wanted her to get help. Close family members flew in, and boy, that was difficult. A pause. Then, we were all petrified. She was a formidable woman. In a recording that surfaced later, Taylor described the moment from her side. The family intervention stopped me so dead in my tracks. It leaves you totally speechless, and it's so sincere and done with such love that you know it must be agony for them. And then the sentence that stopped everything. It was like being slapped in the face with reality, and I thought, my God, I thought I was a good mother. How have I allowed myself to do this to the people I love most in the world? She agreed to go to rehab. One condition. She wanted to wait until morning. On December 5, 1983, Elizabeth Taylor checked into the Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, California. At the center, the most famous actress in the world shared a room with a stranger. She made her own bed. She mopped floors. She attended group therapy, went on meditative walks in the mornings, and sat through lectures on addiction alongside people who'd never been on a magazine cover. Betty Ford herself, who'd been treated for alcohol and medication addiction in 1978, counseled Taylor personally during the stay. Taylor kept a journal. Everyone at the center was required to. In one of the few passages she later read aloud, she described withdrawal in language more vivid than any screenplay. I feel like hell. I'm going through withdrawal. My heart feels big and pounding. I can feel the blood rush through my body. I can almost see it, running like red water over the boulders in my pain-filled neck and shoulders, then through my ears and into my pounding head. My eyelids flutter. Oh God, I am so tired. She paused while reading, leafed through the journal. Emotions moved across her face involuntarily. The rest, she said, is too private. Taylor completed treatment and spoke about it publicly, a decision that Christopher's ex-wife, Eileen Getty, later contextualized. She lived in everyone's home, Getty said. We witnessed her suffering, and maybe that did have power too. She shared that suffering with us. Getty added, if she hadn't have gone public, the chances are it would have leaked to the press anyway. That's when I think there was a real switch that flicked on. Like, actually, better to be the one that puts it out to the world so that you control the narrative. Taylor stopped drinking after that first Betty Ford's day. She didn't stop taking pills. She rationalized that prescriptions from doctors were different. They treated real medical conditions, and her conditions were real. The chronic pain hadn't gone away just because she'd attended group therapy for 7 weeks. In 1988, George Hamilton staged a second intervention. Taylor returned to rehab. During that stay, she met a 36-year-old construction worker named Larry Fortensky, 20 years her junior, who was also a patient. They married in 1991 at Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch and divorced in 1996. The settlement gave Fortensky a $1.2 million lump sum, his Harley-Davidson, and a contractual ban on speaking publicly about Taylor in any forum, whether his remarks are disparaging, flattering, or neutral. The cycle had repeated itself, and the children had watched both iterations. Each time, the hope. Each time, the relapse. Each time, the press coverage turning private pain into public property. The title of this story claims Taylor raised 4 children alone after the money was gone. That claim deserves honest examination. She wasn't alone. Not legally, not for most of the timeline. She was married for nearly the entire span of her child-rearing years. Between Michael Jr.'s birth in 1953 and his adulthood in the 1970s, Taylor moved through 4 husbands with barely a gap between them. She had household staff and the financial resources to maintain large homes on multiple continents. But Taylor herself described a different kind of solitude. Her memoir's admission that she feared her children suffered from not having a father during the pre-Burton years suggests a woman who felt functionally alone in parenthood, even when technically married. The husbands were present but unreliable. The household was full but unstable. She was the only constant, the only person who stayed, marriage after marriage, move after move, crisis after crisis. That kind of aloneness doesn't show up on a marriage certificate. It shows up in a child's memory. The money claim is weaker still. Taylor didn't die poor. The Guardian reported her estate at up to $1 billion at the time of her death. Her White Diamonds perfume, launched through Elizabeth Arden, had generated $1 billion in cumulative sales since 1991. CBS News reported $77 million in fragrance sales in her final year alone. Her jewelry collection brought $156.8 million at auction after her death. She owned real estate in Bel Air and Gstaad. She collected Picasso and Van Gogh before the art market exploded in the 1980s. The money wasn't gone. It never was. What shifted was the source of it and the stability beneath it. By the late 1970s, Taylor's acting career had stalled completely. The transition from movie star to businesswoman hadn't yet happened. During the Warner years, she was dependent on a lifestyle she hadn't built in a city she didn't choose. Each divorce carried financial negotiations. Fisher demanded $750,000 tax-free and use of $250,000 for 10 years before settling, according to the New York Times. Fortensky's settlement cost $1.2 million plus assets. The costs accumulated, even if the wealth always exceeded them. For the children, the question was never whether their mother could pay the bills. It was whether she'd be conscious when they called. In 2004, Taylor was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. She was 72, wheelchair-bound, and largely withdrawn from public life. The body that had been breaking down since she was 12, the back, the lungs, the hips, the brain tumor removed in 1997, had finally exhausted its reserves. Each of Taylor's 4 children carved a path as far from Hollywood spectacle as their mother's fame would allow. Michael Wilding Jr. became a sculptor in Santa Fe, New Mexico, after a brief acting career on shows like Guiding Light and Dallas in the 1980s. Christopher worked as a photographer and sound editor on films including Tombstone, before retiring to Calabasas, California. Liza Todd, who never knew her biological father, attended boarding school in Switzerland, studied art in London and Los Angeles, and became a sculptor known for equine pieces. She lives in upstate New York. Maria Burton, the most private of the 4, dabbled in modeling, married twice, and raised her children away from the cameras. All 4 were at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles when Taylor died on March 23, 2011. She was 79. Taylor's lawyer and co-trustee, Barbara Berkowitz, who worked with her for more than 20 years, described a side of Taylor that the tabloids rarely reached. She always had her family there for holidays. It was very important to her to be the glue that kept all of her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren together. Naomi Wilding, Michael Jr.'s daughter, confirmed the picture. She had an idea that she was responsible for raising the younger generations in the family. It was important to her that she instilled those values in us too. Michael Jr.'s other daughter, Layla, told people that family was number one for her. When asked what she was proudest of in her entire life, Taylor didn't cite Cleopatra, the 2 Academy Awards, the AIDS activism that raised over $270 million, or the perfume empire that kept generating revenue decades after her last film role. "They make me the proudest of anything that I've ever done," she said, meaning her children. Christopher's statement after her death contained the reframing that this entire story turns on. He didn't eulogize a movie star or a glamour icon or a scandal magnate. He said, "Her life has been lived, and her time in the spotlight is now over. But I hope that who my mother was as a person and the fearless life she led will continue to inspire generations to come." Who my mother was as a person. Not who the cameras saw. Not who the tabloids sold. The person who gathered the family for holidays and mopped a floor at Betty Ford and looked at her son with deadened eyes and a syringe in her hand, and still, at the end, had all 4 of her children sitting beside her bed. The tabloids got the scandals. The obituaries got the diamonds. The awards shows got the speeches. The 4 children got the person. Fragile, addicted, chronically ill, fiercely protective, deeply ashamed of the damage she'd caused, and brave enough to say so into a recording that her own family would have to hear. She wasn't a perfect mother. She said so herself, on tape, to the people she'd hurt most. But she was there. Through the husbands and the hospitalizations and the headlines, through the interventions and the relapses, and the long, slow decline of a body that had been failing since childhood. She was there. The children knew who she was because she never managed to hide it from them, even when she hid it from everyone else. That's not a scandal. That's a family. Subscribe for more stories like this.